this is Nathan up at Empire BMX in Austin, Texas. Today we're going to shoot how to build a launch ramp. For a list of tools required, you're going to need safety glasses, a pencil or marker, a tape measure, a right angle, a string to draw the transitions. You need to make sure the string doesn't have any elasticity to it so that it doesn't stretch when you're drawing the transition. A drill, a chalk line, a circular saw, and an extension cord. And one more thing you might need, it doesn't hurt to have a cool shop dog roaming around while you're building, help keep you company. My buddy Deacon here does the trick. So the first step in building a launch ramp is figuring out your transitions. There's things to consider, whether it be radius or height. So at this point, we'll go ahead and figure those things out. What I've done here is I've taken our 8-foot 2x4 and I've screwed it in with 2 feet underneath the piece of ply. And then that makes the overall length 10 feet. The next step is to put a screw for the 10-foot radius, then for the 9-foot, then the 8, and so on. Then you can attach your string to each screw and draw each radius to figure out which one looks best for your ramp. For most quarter pipes and mini ramps, you're probably going to want to go with an 8-foot to 10-foot transition. But usually for most launch ramps, you're going to want to go a little bit mellower. Usually around a 9 to 12-foot radius works well. For our purposes today, we're going to cut the steeper 9-foot transition, and that's going to give us a little bit of extra boost. Next thing we got to do is figure out how tall we want to build this thing. Technically, this sheet of ply is probably big enough to build up to a 3-foot tall ramp, but that's a bit excessive, so we're going to make ours 2 feet tall. You can go ahead and measure and mark your height. And for the top of the launch ramp, we're just going to make it the width of a 2x4, so 3.5 inches. It's going to be right there. And then what we're going to do for the back side of this ramp, we're actually going to put a slight angle to it. That way you can bump jump in and out of it, but it also creates a larger footprint for the ramp, and that way the ramp is less likely to flip forward when you hit it at a high speed. So that's the benefits of doing that. And really this angle can be any angle that you want. I'm just gonna draw a random angle on it. So now that we got our launch ramp template all set up, it's time to break out the circular saw and cut it. So one important thing when using a circular saw to cut a transition, you're gonna wanna make sure you set your blade very shallow. So you're going to want the blade to sit as close to 3/4 of an inch as you can get it. Just enough to where it penetrates and cuts through that sheet of ply. Right there should do it. Go ahead and lock your blade down. The saw is ready to cut. Another thing I like to do with launch ramps is I like to cut the bottom a little bit early. That way it has a smoother transition into the ground, and your bottom of your plywood won't flare up. So I'm going to cut it about right there. And there's your first transition. So with this piece, the net makes the next step pretty easy. We're just going to go ahead and trace directly off of this transition. So today we're going to be building our launch ramp at 20 inches wide. So let's go ahead and begin by marking where we're going to put our ribs so we'll know how many we need to cut. Generally, for most ramps, you want to space the ribs out about every 8 inches apart. Since this is just a launch ramp, we're not really going to be landing in it too much, and we want it to be as lightweight as possible. We're going to space them every 10 inches apart. So for the first rib, it's actually going to be a flat rib. It's going to sit right here. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of mark where it's going to sit. So 2x4s are 1.5 inches. It's going to be 3.5 inches in length. And another 1.5 inches. 1.5 right here. So it's roughly gonna be sitting about right there. And then from the center of that, I'm gonna measure 10 inches to mark my next rib. Also keep in mind, there's going to be a rib on the top. Probably gonna put one in the center right here and one at the bottom. So now that we have these marked, we can go right over to our other transition, get them lined up nice and perfect. And move those markings right over. Center rib. So let's see how many ribs we gotta cut. We gotta cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 ribs total. So now it's time to cut our ribs. The ramp overall is 20 inches wide, so we need to cut the ribs a little bit slimmer to compensate for the transition pieces. Since our transitions are 3/4 of an inch, we're going to have to subtract 3/4 of an inch from either side of the rib. So the overall rib length should be 18.5. So we're gonna cut each rib to 18.5 inches. All right, so now we got all the ribs cut and it's time to start bolting them onto the transitions. So for this point, we're gonna need our drill and we'll do our 3-inch screws for this part. For the first rib on the ramp, we laid it flat, that way it fit on the transition. For the remaining ribs all the way up the transition, we're gonna do them vertically, that way it's a little bit stronger. For each one of these ribs, you should probably be using 2 to 3 screws per side. So for the top rib, we're gonna lay it flat. That's gonna act kind of like a mini deck for the top of the lip. There it is. So once you get the ramp all ribbed up, there's another step that's pretty good to take. The bottoms of these transitions come down to such a sharp point that they're really brittle and really easy to break. If you plan on moving this ramp all over the place, it's pretty much guaranteed that they're gonna break off. So what I like to do is kind of just cut the corners off. They're not really totally necessary. It'll still run flush with the ground without them. So I like to cut them at a little angle, you know, maybe 1/2 inch up the tip of it. Once you finish that step, it's time to start putting down the plywood. So now we can start cutting our plywood to put down on the face of the ramp. Since the ramp is 20 inches wide, we're going to cut out 20-inch pieces by the width, which is 4 feet of the sheet of plywood. So let's go ahead and measure that out. "20 inches. Go to the other side. Mark another 20 inches. Then you get your chalk line. Snap it. Got your line ready to cut. For the facing of the ramp, we're gonna go ahead and grab our shorter screws. Right here we've got 1 5/8. These work perfect. Gonna go ahead, and just for the first layer, you don't need a ton of screws. The top layer will actually pull everything together. So we'll just tack a couple screws in per rib. Make sure everything's nice and square. all the way down the ramp. Got it where you want it. Start driving screws in. So now it's time to cut our next piece of plywood. We're going to measure out 20 inches again. Now we've got that piece cut, we can go back over to our launch ramp and see how long this remaining piece needs to be cut. 13 inches to cut the next piece. So 20 inches wide by 13 inches. Let's go ahead and go measure and cut that. Alright, so now it is time for our final layer of plywood. What you want to do with the final layer, you want to make sure that the seam on the first layer does not line up with the seam on the second layer. So it's basically the seam is going to be supported by a different rib. So we're going to take this remaining bit of 20-inch wide ply. Since this is the final layer, we're going to look and see which side is a little bit smoother. This side has some knots. Side's pretty smooth, so I'm gonna go with that. Hold it up and see what rib we can get it to line up with. So we don't want it to line up with this seam at all. It's looking like our best bet is going to be the third rib up. We're gonna use a square. That's just gonna ensure that the cut is a right angle, which is very important to keep this launch ramp square. You're gonna put it right in the center of that rib. That way this rib is supporting both sheets and you have something to screw into. So now we have our cut board. Gonna apply it to the ramp, make sure it's nice and square and lined up right in the middle of that top rib. Once it is, I'll put some weight on it, get it bent, start driving screws in. It's good to start in the middle of this top rib, work across, and then we're going to do the same, start in the middle, work across all the way down. That way the transition has a nice even bend. On this top layer, we're going to use a few more screws, and that's going to pull everything nice together, snug. So one important thing to note about this final layer, the top layer is going to hang a little bit further off than the first layer is. The reason for that, it's got to be as flush to the ground as possible. That way you don't get a bump at the bottom of the transition. So that's something to keep in mind. You want it to be as flush and as smooth as possible. Now it's time to go back to our sheet of 3/8 plywood and measure another 20-inch wide piece. Same process as before. So now we can take our sheet of ply that we just cut, take it over to the ramp and see where our next cut needs to be made. Have your pencil ready. Get everything lined up and square as we've been doing. Put weight on it so that it follows the bend of the transition. We're going to mark the top of the ramp on both sides. Remember to keep the transition bent during this process. So now we've got it marked, we can use our chalk line, get ready for our next cut. Now it's time to fasten on this final sheet of the layer here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start at this seam while applying pressure to the transition, because I want this seam to be very tight so that's nice and smooth. So start in the middle, not plugged in. And then we can work up the transition in a similar fashion while keeping pressure on the transition and keeping the ply bent. All right, and then the final step, we're gonna take that last bit of our 3/4 inch plywood and we're going to put some on the back face here of the ramp. So now we need to figure out how big that piece needs to be cut to. So for the size of our ramp, let's take a measurement and see what we need to cut. We know it's going to be 20 inches wide, 25 inches, actually 24¼ inches. It's time to screw it into the back. Be sure to hit a rib with each one. And that's pretty much it. So that pretty much wraps up how to build a launch ramp. You can put your own personal twists on it. If it's gonna be outside, it's good to put some paint on it, something weather resistant. We're gonna go ahead and hit it with some Empire stencils. Another thing to keep in mind with launch ramps, it doesn't have to be 2 feet tall. You can go taller with it, you can go lower with it, you can cut different transitions with it. So feel free to play with any of that stuff and just have fun with it, because that's what it's all about.